Okay, so now I am going to introduce our first session, which is going to be given by two wonderful keynote speakers. I'm just going to introduce the speakers and hand over the session to them. So we have two speakers, Fortunate and Julian. Now, Fortunate is a member of the Planning Committee. She leads the Climate, Environment and Health Department at the Center for Sexual Health and HIV/AIDS Research in Zimbabwe. She is a social anthropologist with a focus on climate, health, and policy, and was the chairperson of the first Climate and Health Africa conference, which took place a few weeks ago in Zimbabwe. And I've heard some amazing things about that particular conference, and I think we're hoping to sort of generate the same sort of energy here over the next couple of days. Our second keynote was going to be, well, will be delivered by Julian Sheather, who actually wrote the background paper for this meeting and who has also supported many of the presenters in preparing for this meeting. Unfortunately, Julian is unable to attend due to ill health, and we want to formally thank him in his absence for all the work that he has done. But Julian, in a typically heroic manner, has actually recorded his presentation, which we will watch after Fortunate's keynote. Julian is an ethics consultant for MSF and WHO's Health Ethics and Governance Unit, and the team will play Julian's video right after Fortunate's keynote. So please join me in welcoming Fortunate to the stand.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. It's such an honor to be here today. Catherine, the journey we've walked together organizing the first International Climate and Health Africa Conference is profound. And finding myself here speaking today is quite an honor. And I thought to begin, I would start with a very short story. So back where I come from, I'm Zimbabwean. I grew up in a small city called Victoria Falls. You might have heard about it. You know, when you Google Vic Falls, you see the mighty river, perhaps one of the deepest gorges you would ever see. Beautiful. But just 2 months ago, people were talking about it being dry. The mighty Victoria Falls. Yes, of course, I mean, the river flow is not always consistent. But, you know, having grown up in that city and then going back there, and you see a dry river, that's a bit insane. But that story is not only unique to Victoria Falls. I want to talk about the arid plains of Mount Darwin district, which is one of the hottest in my country. There's a guy called Tadiwa Mpofu who, standing at the entrance of a small rural clinic, observing a line of women and children stretching into the distance. The clinic, designed to cater 100 patients a month, now struggled to serve over just 300. Rising temperatures and prolonged droughts trigger waves of malnutrition, waterborne diseases, and maternal health crises. Yet, as Tadiwa saw it, the silent challenges were not only environmental, they were deeply ethical. And I'm going to try and talk about some of the lessons that we have drawn from the recent first International Climate and Health Africa Conference. And I hope these slides will do justice, but we'll just try and see what conclusions we make at the end. So what you are seeing there is probably something that we all know and we have already seen. So we have seen, at least from pre-industrial times, that there's been an increase in global surface temperatures. If you compare, for example, between 2011 and 2020, there's been a 1.1 degree increase. And that sharp and steady increase, we started seeing it in the mid-20th century. But definitely, we have seen a warmer climate. And this corresponds with the increase in greenhouse gas emissions, particularly carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. But carbon dioxide is more important. As you can see from my slides there, you can see that from about, I'm struggling with, because I'm, thank you. So with carbon dioxide, you can see from about the mid-20th century, we saw a rise in carbon dioxide from 410 parts per million. And that rise has been steady and sharp, at least from the mid-20th century there. And this is even more profound when you start looking at what this means in terms of the people born, for example, in the 1950s. It was cooler. Look at that graph for the child born in 1950. They had most of their youth when temperatures were cooler, but definitely they will age at a time when they start feeling the heat a little bit more. But what's going to happen going forward depends on the mitigation strategies that we put forth. We are likely going to see people born in the 2020s experiencing very high temperatures going forward. But again, it's not cast in stone. It depends on what activities and what mitigation interventions happen. And the future experiences depend on how we address climate change going forward. Sorry, I don't know what's happening with the slides. Can you see them okay? Okay, great. What I see here, they cut. We've already started seeing some changes in our region in particular, and I'm going to focus the story here on Africa. So what we saw, for example, in 2024, in hospital admissions, there's been a surge in hospital admissions and deaths reported from the Gabriel Tour Hospital in Bamako, similar to what I was talking about in my earlier story in Mount Darwin district. It's not just the displacements that we're going to see as a result of floods, but it's the toll on the hospital or the infrastructure, and including the healthcare workers that cater for the people that have been displaced, or people that are experiencing a wave in malaria surges. Extreme Sahel heat wave that hit highly vulnerable populations at the end of Ramadan. We know that this would not have occurred without climate change. Then there's a hospital which recorded 102 deaths over a 4-day period, which is much, much higher than what one would expect, and this happened in 2023. And these are just examples of the many things that we probably already know. And then I also put this about the rainfall in large parts of the Sahel region again, flooding in Sudan, in Nigeria, in Niger, in Chad, Cameroon, things that we continue seeing on a day-to-day basis. And for that particular one, on the first point there, we had about 2,000 people that lost their lives, and millions were displaced. I think what is important and key to take away from this is that the chances of such events occurring could double because of climate change. And again, these are just stories, small little stories that we know, but on a day-to-day basis, there is something happening as a result of climate change. I think in the past few decades, we were talking about HIV as the pandemic, at least in our region. But I think the newest pandemic now is climate change. We are seeing not only mortality and morbidity as a result of climate change, or increased mortality and morbidity as a result of climate change, but also because, you know, it affects food security, then there's malnutrition. It affects how people live and how people engage and socialize. And so the impacts on health are even more pronounced. This is from the recent IPCC report. And I want you to focus on the health and well-being impacts. You can see that climate change is likely going to see a rise on infectious diseases, heat, malnutrition, harm from wildfires, mental health, and displacement, and the like. And if you look at other aspects like water availability and food production, at the end of the line, the impacts are mostly experienced in the health sector or in terms of health outcomes. And this is what I want you to look at a little bit more. And this is what the IPCC has been talking about in the past few years in terms of the adverse impacts from human-caused climate change, and that these are likely going to intensify in the coming years. And again, here, if you look at it's the same narrative really, but if you look at the global versus Africa, that's the first row, and the second one, that's global, first row here, and Africa here. And then look at the impacts on well-being. Displacement is going to be increasing, and the impacts are adverse. And the confidence levels were much higher, meaning that it's likely going to happen, and the consequences much dire. Right. Now, in terms of vulnerability and exposure, to climate change, first, what increases the risk is not just because of that flood or the increase in temperature, but the socioeconomic, political, and environmental factors continue to drive the vulnerability and then sharpen the inequities and widen that shaft. So, for example, employment in climate-exposed sectors. You see that about 60% or so of people in sub-Saharan Africa are employed in agriculture. And agriculture is highly impacted by climate change. And 95% of cropland is rain-fed. The growth of populations, infrastructure, and agriculture in areas exposed to climate hazards. For example, low-lying coastal areas. About 60% of urban dwellers in Africa live in informal settlements, and 60% or so work in informal employment. So all these things make it even harder for these populations to manage in the context of climate change. Then vulnerability and exposure in human settlements. These are just examples of what we have seen and probably already know. You can see that low-income housing is likely to be damaged in storms, in floods, but also temperatures tend to be higher inside the home when it's hot outside. We have already seen from the work we've done in Zimbabwe, for example, that indoor temperatures tend to be higher than outdoor temperatures. So when you are experiencing 37 degrees outside, temperatures inside are 4 to 6 degrees. Then, you know, these people continued to be marginalized because the effects start to compound. And you push populations from where they live, and then we start to see the swelling of informal settlements and slums. Oh, sorry. And food security, a story we already know. We know that between 1974 and 2010, the maize and wheat yields in Africa definitely decreased. And maize is a staple for most, as is wheat, and 2 in every 3 Africans report and perceive that climate conditions for agriculture production worsened over the past decades. So already there are dire consequences there. But water is another story that we always talk about. In Southern Africa as a whole, river flows mostly decreased from 1970 to 2010. And that's why I think my observation about the Victoria Falls are not misplaced. And the consequences are cascading to other sectors. And this is where the aspects of ethics start to come in, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Then in terms of losses, these losses are felt at the individual, at home, and the community and at country levels. So we did talk about net losses, for example, in terms of, you know, broader wheat and maize. But what also happens at the household level, people start experiencing household food insecurity. When life changes, there's a loss in the sense of self. People lose meaning when they lose what is most important to them. And we don't talk about that narrative a little bit more. Higher prices of food when it's scarcer, destroyed homes, displacements, and all these tend to affect the most vulnerable populations. And I think even in terms of the outcomes, there's decreased educational attainment, decreased nutritional outcomes, and decreased health outcomes more in general. We don't talk a lot about you know, HIV and climate change, but there's already evidence that the gains made in addressing HIV, particularly in access to treatment, are likely to be reversed when we don't talk about the impacts on HIV. But what we do know, for example, is the expansion of the mosquito to higher altitudes. For example, what has been seen in East Africa. And in areas that were not malarious, we have started to see them becoming malarious, but we need more evidence and more information what the implications mean. Cholera outbreaks, typhoid, medieval diseases are starting to see their way again, and in context where health systems are already fragile. Then heat-related mortality has increased, and most of the health systems are not able to fully determine that this is a heat shock, for example, or understand what to do when there's a surge of patients coming into the hospital because of heat waves. Malnutrition is rising as temperature rises. And these are just examples. There's much more happening as a result of climate change, and the effects are more pronounced in the health sector and in the health outcomes. In terms of the funding terrain, at the Climate and Health Africa conference A representative from the World Bank reported that, climate change could drive 132 million people into extreme poverty by 2030. And this will undermine all the work that we've done on sustainable development goals. And climate change could also generate about 15 trillion in excess healthcare costs by 2050. Climate change could displace 1.2 billion people by 2050. So what we're talking about here is not just another story about, health. We're talking about the biggest pandemic of our time. And this is the magnitude of the climate health crisis. But what is important, I guess, is the understanding of the nuanced country-level context. What is it that is really driving this, and what could be done about it? So the answer would be simple. We should be doing something about adaptation and mitigation. But why are we not doing that? I mean, it would seem simple, right? So the issues are on ethics. Without proper ethics, no matter how much you know the problem, it's difficult to implement lasting solutions. So some of the reasons are because there's, lack of political will. But why are we failing to generate this political will is the question. Lack of evidence, fair enough. We can generate evidence, but why is it difficult to generate enough evidence to inform adaptation and mitigation interventions? Are we telling the stories that need to be told? If you don't tell the story in the right way, it's difficult to come up with a solution that is lasting. And it is in those stories that ethical issues are embodied. But some of it is quite obvious. In many cases, the existing adaptation deficit is clear enough as evidence, and yet very little is happening. And this is just on adaptation. Very, very little is happening in Africa on mitigation. So most of the responses are, because there's no funding. Okay, let's look at Africa's share of global climate research funding. Okay, it looks like it's, rising, but that's just 5%. Just look on the vertical axis there, on the y-axis. At most, 3.8% of global funding for climate change research especially is spent on African topics. Just 3.8, and most of the impacts are felt there, experienced there, because of the historical context of that region. And African institutions receive only about 14.5% of that 3.8%. So these are also ethical concerns that need to be interrogated. So yes, lack of funding is one thing, but the share and distribution of this funding needs to be questioned, and we need to talk about it transparently. So when you hear people talking about action, the aspects are really on, transdisciplinarity, multisectorality. This is what we need. It starts by understanding the context, co-designing, co-developing, co-producing interventions. And the moment we start talking about those things, we are now starting to talk about the framework on bioethics. And this is what connects us here together. From the Climate and Health Africa Conference, we had the pleasure of having Catherine Liedler championing what we call Track E. Track E was on ethics. And this was the conference held in Harare, Zimbabwe, and it mostly had 5 tracks, but I want to talk about track E, which was focusing on ethics. But just so you know, if you look at that table, I hope you can see it. These were the total number of abstracts that we received, about nearly 600 abstracts from Africa alone. And we had organized these into 5. The first one being on the pathophysiology and biological mechanisms. Very little is happening, but something. Then health impacts and epidemiology, very popular, and for obvious reasons. Then adaptation, interventions, and building climate resilient health systems. I did about 198 abstracts submitted. But look at track E. Overall, it had 54. Right. Again, it's not that bad, okay? But it shows that very little is happening on the continent to interrogate ethics. But something, I don't know, Catherine, we can discuss a bit more on this, but we only had about 54, and we tried to ensure that about 30 of these, 34 or so, made it to oral and poster presentations. Now, I know this is too busy, but I was trying to come up with a synthesis of sort on what the aspects were from these abstracts submitted on the continent. So there were about 4 themes, I think, from my analysis. The first being vulnerabilities and health impacts. People are talking about this on the continent, particularly the impacts of extreme weather events on livelihoods, migration, infrastructure, and the widening inequalities. Then HIT and maternal health, there is some talk on this. So when we're talking of vulnerable populations, I think the easiest that's happening on the continent is to talk about maternal outcomes and birth outcomes. And we are seeing that there was some trend, not just in track E, but also in other tracks like B and C. And I think there were about 4 only. I know it's a theme, but there were only 4 abstracts that we're talking about HIV and climate change. Then equity in adaptation and resource allocation. So aspects to do with resource prioritization and justice in health systems. Then inclusivity and community engagement. So aspects to do with participation and co-design with there. Indigenous knowledge systems and traditional systems. There was a talk on challenging the epistemic justice framework, to talk a little bit more about what that means. Then aspects to do with stakeholder engagement, particularly on institutional arrangements, ethical governance frameworks. Do they really empower the most vulnerable populations? Then aspects to do with intersectionality, gender, and social justice. I think for me, these were the main themes emerging from track E. And in terms of gaps, yes, there were highlights on intersectional vulnerabilities, but that critical analysis is not yet there. Poverty intersecting with heat, poor health service access, co-benefits. We haven't heard much on this from a research perspective. Then, yes, there was talk about indigenous knowledge systems and traditional systems, but the issue really is on epistemic justice, and this is not being critiqued adequately. Then aspects to do with the global power dynamics and institutional inaction. Really challenging existing and historical inequities on the continent or within a context. We haven't seen much critique on that, but also looking at models that work in situ. then there wasn't much, if anything, on mental health. It's really an empty plate. Even on the keynote speeches, if you remember, for those that were there, we couldn't find representation, or at least even a small, quick and dirty research done on the ground to understand the implications on mental health. So that's a gap. Then ethical gaps in technological solutions, we didn't hear much on that, and we would like to know more, particularly on the ethics aspects of it. There are aspects to do with privacy concerns and equity in digital health tools. We are not hearing much discussion there. Then intergenerational and environmental ethics. Non-human suffering absent in frameworks. There wasn't much talk there. Then sustainability ethics are not being discussed, and that's a gap. Then interdisciplinarity and multisectorality, there is talk there, but there are fewer opportunities for cross-discipline and the multisectoral collaborations for comprehensive climate health solutions. Such a platform offers that opportunity, people coming from different disciplines coming together to talk about climate change, but also ethics, helps us to come together. From what we saw at the Climate and Health Africa conference, we thought this wasn't being discussed in depth. And philosophical critiques, some of them work better in the North, but we want critiques or criticism that is better placed in the context where the impacts are felt the most. So we need that critique of Western-centric frameworks so that we are able to understand African ethical systems like Ubuntu and communal ethics. Of course, funding gaps have been talked about, but not enough in terms of maybe accessing the Green Climate Fund. It's very difficult for African countries to unlock that. And it's an ethical issue, right? So there is the Green Climate Fund, but only 2 countries in Southern Africa have been able to access that in the past 10 years. So again, we need to be able to talk about that more openly. Then policy and capacity gaps in terms of policy, research, data, and infrastructure. And there is a lot of ethical debate embodied there that we should talk about. Did I do that again? Yeah, I think that was my last, actually. Yeah, thank you.
Hi there, and good afternoon, at least from the UK, where I'm speaking from. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Julian Sheather, and I'm an ethicist working with Catherine and her team at the WHO's Health, Ethics and Governance Unit. First of all, I'd like to say to apologise for not being there in person. I'd love to have met you all, but I've had a few health issues. Looks like they're resolving themselves, so all is good, but please accept my apologies for not being there in person, although I'm sure you're going to have a wonderful time. Fortunate told me, she talked to me about her presentation, and my understanding is that you've had a very rich, interesting presentation about the practical and ethical challenges associated with undertaking research into health and climate change in a sub-Saharan African context. What I'm going to do is quite briefly and quite quickly to address a number of higher level ethical issues associated with the whole research, the ethics of research into health and climate change terrain. Bit of a landscape, just the high level issues. Now, probably should go without saying, not every piece of research will encounter all of these ethical issues, but it is likely that research at some point will touch upon one or another of them. And it's a kind of article of faith for me that research, good research like good policy, that fails to take into account relevant ethical issues is likely to fail in a number of ways. It's likely to be poor research or poor policy, and it always risks baking in structural ethical injustices and other forms of ethical detriment, enormous cost to questions of justice and fairness. So that's what I'm going to touch upon briskly today. It won't surprise you, it won't surprise any of you if I start out with just a brief overview of the research environment. We know that the health impacts of climate change are well recognised. When I undertook a landscape review in this area a couple of years ago, people were already starting to use AI to try and sort the enormous amount of research in this context. Climate change, we know, according to the WHO, is the single biggest health threat facing humanity. So critical stuff. We know that research into health and climate change is intensifying, including into adaptation and mitigation, but there are some critical gaps, including, importantly, the mental health impacts of climate change, and also, I think, some of the ethics of research into some of the technological interventions designed to adapt or mitigate. Having said that, understanding of the ethical issues associated with research into climate change and health is nonetheless poorly developed. And that's our raison d'etre, really. That's why we're working in this space. We're trying to flesh out some of the most significant ethical challenges associated with research in this context. And as I've said, unless we identify critical ethical issues, research risks locking in and exacerbating existing inequalities and ethical deficits, and it is critical that we address them, identify and address them as early as possible. So that's where we are in terms of the overall terrain of research in this context. But again, it won't surprise you if you hear me starting off with a discussion of the importance of global justice in the context of the ethics of research into health and climate change. We know that climate change threatens a world already disfigured by, at times, grotesque inequalities. That's a simple global fact. We also know that many of those who are hardest hit by the health and other impacts of climate change are amongst the least responsible for the release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Simultaneously, because often we're talking about countries that haven't passed through intensive periods of industrial development, industrialization, many of those hardest impacted have the fewest resources to mitigate and adapt to those challenges, including the associated health challenges. So climate change is taking place in a world already riven with serious inequalities. And we also know that research into health globally can both reflect and participate in those global inequalities. So one of the big questions for us is how can, from more or less the beginning, research into health and climate change address and meaningfully respond to the challenges of global justice in this context, something I think we all need to be significantly alert to. One of the ways in which the research community more broadly has sought to address some of these issues about global justice is through putting forward concepts and approaches to support participatory research, the co-creation of research, the co-creation and co-development of research agendas and research priorities, looking at participation in the development of research itself, the undertaking of research, and also the distribution of the findings of that research. So given the serious challenges of global justice, how can participatory research in the context of health and climate change, how can we meaningfully address participatory research? How do we incorporate local needs, perspectives and interests in ways that are meaningful, in ways that address some of these inequities? We're increasingly aware, and importantly aware, of the enormous contribution that Indigenous peoples and their knowledges can make in the context of health, of climate change broadly, and also health and climate change. But what does meaningful and respectful engagement with Indigenous peoples and their knowledges look like in the context of health and climate change? And how can we address institutional biases and shortcomings throughout the research cycle that can further and change, further bake in the kinds of injustices that we have been talking about? Another critical area associated with climate change is the increasing understanding that climate change is a time-lagged phenomenon. Because of the way in which the complexities of the global atmosphere work, because carbon dioxide particularly builds up and endures in the atmosphere, it has a cumulative effect, an intensifying effect. And on current trajectories of greenhouse gas emissions, far heavier harms are going to fall on future generations, including what will almost inevitably be, for some people's, existential threats. And by and large, research, understandably, and in some ways for good reasons, is geared to real-time, this-world threats to health. Morally, it's plausible to say, let us concern ourselves with the most urgent and immediate threats. But there's something in the nature of climate change, this deferred and lagged aspect to it, that means we have to start asking questions about how research can meaningfully address future impacts and what kinds of moral claims future generations may have on us. How can those obligations to future generations begin to shape and inform the research agenda? Questions of intergenerational justice are philosophically complex, we know that. We also know they're practically complex because the nature of funding, the nature of way we respond, again, tends to prioritize immediate and real-world threats. But we need to begin to be thinking more alertly about how we can ensure that some of those future interests are incorporated into our research agendas. Questions of justice, as unsurprisingly in some ways, are shaping, as I've said, the research, ethical concerns about the research agenda. And given that research, one of the kind of definitions of research is the attempt to identify generalizable new knowledge, questions about what we mean by knowledge become very important. And the global nature of climate change and associated health research forces us to ask questions, or invites us to ask questions about what does count as knowledge in the kind of global context, and how do we navigate different epistemologies that have emerged from different traditions, different ways of thinking, different ways of responding to the world. How do we navigate those different worldviews? How do we address structural power imbalances in the global knowledge economy? Critical questions. Also, I think importantly, how do we meaningfully and respectfully address questions about incommensurability between different worldviews? Really, really important questions. What do we mean by knowledge? Who gets to define what we mean by knowledge? And how do we, as researchers, ethicists, policymakers, how do we meaningfully and respectfully navigate these differences in worldview? Very, very important questions of epistemic justice arising in this context. The last kind of standalone ethical area of ethical question and concern that I'm going to leave you with is to do with questions about the value of nature, although the concept of nature, as we know, is challenged, problematic, difficult, the value of the non-human world. How do we address these kinds of questions? One Health and planetary health approaches, we know that they're beginning, for good and understandable reasons, to gain traction. They're identifying the extent to which we are interdependent with natural environments. Our health cannot meaningfully thrive without some form of health, however, whatever we mean by that, within the natural environments that support us. Although sometimes, and I've been guilty of this myself, One Health and planetary health approaches are described as novel. They draw on long-standing indigenous approaches. And with my limited understanding of those approaches, it looks to me as if the idea that we somehow stand aside and apart and independent from nature is an absurdity within those contexts. Interdependence, interconnectedness, morally, ethically, critical as well as practically. So among the questions we need to ask are there, and for many people, and particularly indigenous peoples, as I say, this question may not be meaningful, are there independent rights or interests in nature? If there are such rights or interests, when and how should we respond to them? What impact might that kind of valuing have upon our research? It's not going to affect all research, of course. As I've said, none of these issues are likely to impact all research, but in some of our research, these questions are going to be alive. How also do we proceed where human interests and non-human interests may be in tension? So absolutely critical for the research agenda. It's going to be difficult, philosophically again, and practically again. We're in very difficult country when we start to push away from core anthropocentric understandings of value, the idea that, you know, humankind somehow is at the pinnacle of creation. These older views, in some ways, my heritage, Judeo-Christian heritage, there you see these ideas that man, humankind has distinct, independent moral value and is in some ways, you know, oversees creation. Well, these approaches, this area, climate change, this new sense that we're beginning to see nature with very different eyes, it's beginning to ask us some very, very important questions. As I say, practically, philosophically challenging, but absolutely front and center. The idea that nature is just a kind of infinite larder for our exploitation is beginning to seem increasingly absurd. But what that means in this context, what that means for research, what that means for the ethics here, all questions, important questions to be developed. Finally, and as I'm here in some ways as part of the World Health Organization, their Health Ethics and Governance Unit, with its global span, its global reach, another critical and in some ways more practical question are the kinds of challenges that research in this context provides for our global institutions. We know that climate change is absolutely globalized. We know that it has no interest whatsoever in national boundaries, in national self-interests. There's a global process that will have impacts, albeit differential, across the globe. We're also in a time, I think we can reasonably say, that there are movements to retrench from global institutions, to retreat back into insular politics bounded by the nation state and national interests. Just at the time when climate change, the most significant global challenge of our time, is intensifying, this suspicion and unease about global institutions is arising. So how can we, in this context, how can our institutions best address the trans-jurisdictional issues and actions that are required in order to address this and those questions are equally as pertinent in relation to global research institutions. And also, I think, importantly and critically, though again it's challenging, what possibilities exist for meaningfully devolving power, for respecting local approaches and local epistemologies? What does a legitimate, respectful regionalism look like, and how can we begin or continue, depending upon your perspective, to decolonize, in a sense, this global knowledge kind of terrain, so that meaningful, important knowledge production can grow in the areas and regions and localities where these health impacts that we are researching will be significantly felt. So once again, to say, I'm sorry I can't be with you. I know you're going to have an interesting and exciting time. The agenda certainly is fascinating. And as I say, these are some headline ethical issues. Not all research will engage with all of these issues. Some research may not need to address any of them, but I think there's little doubt that most research undertaken in the context of health and climate change is going to have to navigate at least some of these ethical challenges. And the imperative now, as early as possible, to get them right means that we can head off the possibility, as I've said, of baking in already grotesque global injustices into the research agenda into health and climate change. Thank you very much.